The grand conclave hall of the Cygnian Ascendancy pulsed with a cold, ambient light drawn from the crystalline latticework supporting the vaulted ceiling, a space so vast that the assembled delegates seemed like mere motes of agitated dust, suspended above the polished obsidian floor. Thousands of years of accumulated political weight pressed down upon the quorum. This was the nexus where the fate of 3 major galactic sectors was currently being determined, not by weapon discharge, but by the agonizing inertia of uncertainty. At the central dais, overlooking the swirling holographic projections detailing resource flows and strategic vulnerabilities, stood the presiding triumvirate, their tripartite physiognomies betraying an almost physical strain under the pressure of the unknown. The air itself felt thick with synthesized ozone and unspoken dread, a palpable miasma generated by the hundreds of representatives from species bound by the covenant of stellar stability for millennia. They were discussing the anomaly. They were discussing the Sol hegemony. The central projection, usually displaying complex gravitational harmonics charting the movements of neighboring stellar bodies, now displayed only a singular, stark telemetry reading. An object designated Intruder 7 Gamma had decelerated from near-relativistic velocity to stationary relative to the designated neutral marker point in the Kalan void, a region deliberately kept free of established navigational beacons to discourage unauthorized presence. This deceleration was the first sign of true, terrifying intelligence from the species they had previously catalogued as Terran primitives, or more colloquially, simply humans. For cycles, they had been viewed as a localized nuisance, an emergent species whose internal squabbles prevented meaningful expansion beyond their home stellar neighborhood. They were expected to eventually succumb to resource exhaustion or self-inflicted societal collapse, as nearly all Type 0 civilizations eventually did. This expectation, the foundation upon which the Cygnian hegemon's political stability rested, was now fracturing under the weight of impossible physics demonstrated by the Intruder 7 Gamma. "Its kinetic dampening fields," stated Ambassador Vrix of the Rhydonian Directorate, his voice a dry, clicking resonance amplified through the hall's acoustic baffles, "defy established principles of mass displacement. The energy expenditure required for such instantaneous transition from near light-speed movement to absolute stasis suggests either a catastrophic failure of containment, which would result in self-immolation, or a mastery of applied gravitational constants that places them leagues beyond the theoretical limits we ourselves have modeled." Vrix adjusted the sensory filaments around his ocular stalks, a gesture indicating extreme intellectual discomfort. "We have observed primitive warp signatures emanating from their systems for 2 standard centuries. We expected gradual advancement, perhaps reaching parity in another millennium. This is not gradual. This is instantaneous transcendence of known constraints." Seated just below the dais was the Cygnian High Chancellor, Xylos, whose very posture radiated the accumulated wisdom and subtle arrogance of a species that had charted the galaxy for uncounted ages. Xylos did not address Vrix directly. The Cygnian method favored addressing the structural concept rather than the individual vector. "The Rhydonian observation is noted, Directorate. However, the danger lies not in their technical capability, which we may eventually replicate or supersede, but in their intent. We have extended standard diplomatic probes, 3 distinct greetings in 3 distinct linguistic matrices, and have received only absolute silence. This is not the behavior of a species seeking integration. It is the posture of a predator assessing the kill zone." Xylos's voice, synthesized into smooth, resonating baritones that carried across the immense space, carried the weight of command. "They possess the means to be anywhere instantly, yet they choose to hover silent at the edge of established boundaries. What does silence imply in a diplomatic context, esteemed colleagues?" A ripple of agreement, manifesting as subtle shifts in environmental lighting across the various delegations, swept through the hall. Silence, in the codified language of galactic politics, was aggression. A refusal to acknowledge the established order was an act of war in slow motion. The delegates from the minor subsectors, those who lived under the explicit protection and subtle dominance of the ascendancy, looked towards the Cygnian leaders with increasing desperation. Their economies, their very survival, were predicated on the predictable stability maintained by the ascendancy's military and diplomatic hegemony. This unpredictable arrival threatened the delicate balance of tribute and protection. "Elder Counselor," Thrax of the Krill Imperium, representing the more militaristic faction aligned with the Ascendancy, interjected, his voice a grinding sound like tectonic plates shifting. Chancellor, forgive my directness, but your emphasis on intent delays the necessary action. We possess overwhelming defensive saturation in this sector. Their single vessel, we estimate it to be a medium-class exploratory craft based on their known construction profiles, is arrayed against the combined might of Sector Delta's rapid deployment forces. If this is an act of aggression, let us meet it with the expected response. Let us demonstrate the cost of violating established territorial definitions. Thrax made a gesture towards a tactical display that flared into existence near the dais, showing the immense, shimmering network of defensive platforms and patrol vectors surrounding the Kalan Void marker. The scale was breathtaking, enough power to sterilize a populated moon cluster. Xylos tilted his primary sensory array, a gesture of profound weariness. And risk what, Counselor? If their kinetic dampening is as advanced as the Rhydonians suggest, a direct energy strike might prove entirely ineffective, merely absorbed or dispersed by a shielding technology we cannot even detect. Worse, if they possess the capacity to nullify our primary strategic advantage, our ability to project overwhelming force across vast distances, then the projection of that force becomes a demonstration of our weakness, not our strength. We do not understand them. Understanding must precede engagement. The debate spiraled into familiar channels. Fear versus caution, the impulse to crush the unknown versus the mandate to preserve stability. The humans remained inscrutable. Their single ship, a sleek matte-black spindle of geometry that seemed almost offensively simple against the baroque complexity of established starfaring designs, simply held position. It emitted no detectable internal heat signature, no active sensor pings, no discernible communications attempts that fit any known mathematical or linguistic framework. It was a void in the data stream, an insult to the millennia of exhaustive catalog building undertaken by the Ascendancy's astronomical divisions. Vrix provided the most chilling analysis, delivered with the detached precision of a biological pathologist examining a virulent new strain. Their initial emergence into the galactic sphere was characterized by extreme internal violence, a phase we logged as necessary for their species, maturation, the culling of weaker genetic lines, the forging of unified ideological structures. However, their trajectory from that point suggests a fundamental psychological divergence. They discarded technologies based on self-destruction, nuclear fission, biological warfare, not because they could not master them, but because they deemed them inefficient for long-term goal attainment. They reached a plateau of brute force and consciously chose a different path. A path focused on optimization and absolute systemic control over localized entropy. This implies a level of species-wide philosophical cohesion we have never encountered. They are not driven by territorialism or resource acquisition in the manner of the Krill or the older Orion species. Their drive appears internal, almost conceptual. The philosophical weight of this possibility settled heavily. If humans were not motivated by the standard drivers of interstellar expansion, power, resources, ideological domination, then what were they motivated by? The silence felt less like preparation for attack and more like patient, almost anthropological observation. They were watching the other species react to their presence, testing the stability of the cage before choosing where to step. For 2 full subjective cycles, the conclave remained locked in this tense, circular debate. The holographic projections flickered, showing the slow, inexorable alignment of the Ascendancy's layered defenses, a tapestry of kinetic barriers, warp field disruptors, and long-range antimatter projectors. All preparations were complete, yet the trigger remained unpulled, suspended by the Chancellor's profound reluctance to make the first, possibly catastrophic move against an entity that had so casually defied Newtonian expectation. Finally, Xylos signaled for absolute quiet, silencing the murmurs and the data overlays. He focused his attention, and the attention of the entire conclave, onto the projection of the solitary human vessel. We will proceed with the protocol of first contact, adapted for extreme caution. We will send a non-military vessel, minimally armed, bearing only the standardized charter of Galactic Accords. It will approach slowly, maintaining maximal distance, and transmit the universal greeting sequence, a pure mathematical declaration of sentience. Xylos paused, his crystalline eyes catching the reflected light. If they choose to ignore this, we will reassess our definition of patience, but we will not fire first unless unequivocally provoked. The risk of provoking an unknown variable with catastrophic counter-capabilities is currently judged higher than the risk of appearing weak. The Rhydonian ambassador nodded slowly, accepting the pragmatic concession. The Krill counselor grumbled audibly, clearly dissatisfied with the delay, but offered no immediate objection. The mechanism of diplomacy, however reluctant, had been set in motion. The Cygnian response vessel, the Observer of Neutrality, a diplomat-class carrier designed for resilience rather than aggression, began its deliberate journey toward the designated marker point, carrying the weight of galactic expectation on its hull. The weight was agonizing. Days blurred into cycles as the Observer traversed the vast, empty gulf of the Kalan void. Sensor data streamed back to the Conclave, confirming the consistent, unmoving presence of the human vessel. It remained a passive black shape against the stardusted backdrop, utterly indifferent to the approaching diplomatic outreach. The tension in the hall did not ease. If anything, it tightened, concentrating into a sharp point of near-sympathetic nervous distress among the delegates. Then, precisely as the Observer reached the halfway point of its programmed approach vector, the silence broke. It was not a signal broadcast. It was not a pulse of energy. It was a localized, highly structured manipulation of the vacuum itself, a sudden, brief imposition of order onto the chaotic background noise of the cosmos. The Observer of Neutrality's passive sensor logs, when cross-referenced by the Cygnian Analysis Core, showed that the human vessel had momentarily bent spacetime in a focused, directional cone pointed directly at the incoming Cygnian ship. It was an event so subtle, so profoundly controlled, that had the Cygnian vessel not been specifically tasked with monitoring for exotic phenomena, the event would have been lost in the cosmic static. The message, when deciphered by the Ascendancy's top xenolinguists, was not a greeting. It was a single, complex data packet containing a complete, high-fidelity holographic rendering of the human vessel itself, projected directly onto the bridge of the Observer. It was an introduction delivered not through communication protocols, but through a direct demonstration of their mastery over local physics. And accompanying the visual data was a short, curt textual transmission, rendered in a mathematically derived common language used for historical deep space surveying. The text read, "Your approach vector is inefficient. Adjust trajectory by 0.03 degrees starboard. Maintain present velocity, we await." In the Grand Conclave Hall, the collective intake of breath was so synchronized that the environmental processors registered a fractional pressure drop. The human vessel had not just acknowledged the Cygnian approach, it had corrected it, demonstrating superior knowledge of navigation within that specific gravitational pocket, and issued a command with the casual authority of an artisan instructing an apprentice. There was no appeal, no query, no diplomatic phrasing, only an imperative rooted in demonstrated superior understanding. Chancellor Xylos felt a cold wave wash over his cerebral structure. This was not mere arrogance. This was the absolute certainty of competence. They had not even bothered to engage the diplomatic greetings. They had bypassed the ceremony entirely, assessing the Cygnian ship's flawed trajectory before it even reached its intended meeting point. "They analyzed our approach," Xylos stated, his voice barely a whisper, yet resonating with the gravity of the realization. "They did not wait for us to arrive. They dictated our arrival parameters remotely, using only a subtle manipulation of local gravity tensors. They have established dominance not through force, but through superior operational knowledge of the environment we share." Thrax, the Krill counselor, looked pale even through his thick chitinous plating. "Chancellor, this is an insult calculated to provoke a breakdown of protocol. They are telling us we cannot even navigate our own approaches correctly." "No, Counselor," Vrix interjected, his filaments still rigid in concentration. "They are showing us that their operational envelope is wider than ours. They are not insulting us. They are establishing the terms of the meeting based on objective, verifiable parameters of physical reality. If we argue the command, we admit ignorance of the environment. If we comply, we admit subordination to their assessment. This is the core of their psychology, efficiency above ceremony." Xylos made his decision, swift and absolute, fueled by the chilling clarity of the moment. "The Observer will comply with the alteration immediately. We will proceed, but we will approach this encounter not as equals meeting across a diplomatic threshold, but as petitio." Nurs seeking instruction on the true nature of this sector. Inform the bridge crew of the Observer that they are entering contact with a civilization whose mastery of fundamental physics appears absolute. Advise them to prioritize observation and logical data recording over any preconceived notions of parity. The next phase of contact was conducted under an atmosphere so pressurized it threatened to collapse the structural integrity of the monitoring stations. The observer of neutrality adjusted its course by the minuscule degree dictated, a movement that felt monumental in its implication. As it drew closer to the black spindle of the human vessel, the environmental sensors began to register energy fields unlike anything previously catalogued. These were not destructive fields. They were stabilizing fields, impossibly complex matrices that seemed to enforce a perfect local equilibrium around the human craft, minimizing external interference and maximizing internal informational integrity. When the observer achieved the required distance, maintaining a pre-programmed perimeter of extreme caution, a new transmission originated from the human vessel. This time, it was comprehensive. It was a compressed burst of data that, once unlocked by the Cygnian onboard analytical engine, flooded the conclave hall's primary display with unprecedented visual and structural information. It was not a simple schematic. It was a living, evolving blueprint of the human vessel itself, overlaid with real-time diagnostics of its internal systems. The Cygnian engineers, accustomed to seeing stylized representations or heavily encrypted data packages from other advanced species, were confronted with raw, unfiltered operational truth. They saw the propulsion matrix, a system that didn't generate thrust, but rather manipulated localized inertia directly, allowing for instantaneous shifts in momentum without perceived acceleration forces. They saw the hull composition, a layered composite structure incorporating elements unknown to the Cygnian periodic tables, capable of dissipating phenomenal thermal and kinetic stress with zero residual signature. And then the core element of the revelation arrived, a full, unredacted record of the human vessel's mission profile. This was the most shocking element. The data packet contained not military objectives or resource surveys or even diplomatic preamble. It contained observations of the entire local cluster, including the borders of the Ascendancy, the internal trade routes of the Rhydonian Directorate, and the military staging posts of the Krill Imperium. All logged, analyzed, and cross-referenced. Ambassador Vrix leaned forward, his multiple eyes rapidly cycling through the data stream that overlaid the hall. Chancellor, they have mapped our infrastructure with precision exceeding our own deep penetration survey probes. They know the maintenance schedule of the Rhydonian orbital defense grids. They know the political fault lines within the Krill military command structure. They did all this while we believed them isolated. And their stated purpose? Xylos demanded, leaning into the microphone console, his composed exterior finally beginning to show fissures of profound shock. The primary text log of the mission profile scrolled across the display, rendered now in stark, universally recognizable mathematics. Observation cycle 47 complete. Assessment. Localized sapient civilizations maintain operational stability via complex, inefficient regulatory structures built upon self-imposed resource scarcity models and reactive defense postures. Structural integrity is adequate, but risks catastrophic failure due to systemic feedback loops inherent in hierarchical governance. Then came the second, more alarming paragraph, the crux of the human arrival. Directive. Introduce corrective data sets to mitigate observed structural inefficiency prior to regional energetic saturation event predicted within T-300 standard cycles. Direct intervention unnecessary at this temporal threshold, awaiting confirmation of passive data reception. The hall fell into a silence so deep that the artificial hum of the life support system seemed deafening. The humans had not come to conquer, nor to trade, nor to negotiate. They had come as an external audit team, observing a galactic ecosystem they had already analyzed, determined to be unstable, and offering corrective solutions before the inherent flaws led to a system-wide collapse. They saw the millennia-old order of the Ascendancy not as a rival power, but as a failing engineering project. Thrax the militarist found his voice, thick with wounded pride and a dawning, cold terror. They believe we are failing. They believe the stability we have maintained for epochs is a mere inefficiency waiting to be debugged. This is intolerable arrogance. Xylos raised a calming hand, his mind racing across the implications. if the humans possessed the physics to arrive. Silently and observe without detection, their strategic advantage was not just tactical, it was ontological. They understood the universe at a deeper level than the ascendancy had ever dared to contemplate. To fight them was suicide. To ignore them was eventual collapse, according to their own meticulously calculated projections. Ambassador Vrix, Xylos commanded, his voice regaining its crystalline steadiness, a mask of serene authority replacing the momentary shock. Initiate a direct, non-mathematical encrypted channel to the human vessel. Use the Tier 1 diplomatic cipher, the one reserved for contact with presumed descendant species. Our response must reflect absolute comprehension of their assessment, tempered by an assertion of self-determination, but crucially framed as a request for clarification, not confrontation. The transmission was prepared, a complex weave of linguistic nuance designed to convey respect for power while safeguarding cultural sovereignty. It took 3 torturous cycles to transmit and confirm receipt. The response from the human vessel was immediate, direct, and devoid of the expected diplomatic buffer. A single voice, synthesized but possessing a strangely compelling resonance, neither inherently male nor female, perfectly neutral in cadence, filled the communication channels linking the observer to the conclave hall. Signian Ascendancy, your request for clarification has been received. State the core ambiguity in the received data set. There was no introduction, no polite preamble to the conversation. The human entity demanded the crux of the matter instantly. Xylos took a deep breath, utilizing his species' advanced respiratory system to regulate his internal chemistry. Your analysis suggests systemic failure within the established order of this sector due to inherent resource scarcity models. We have maintained functional equilibrium for millennia through managed distribution and carefully balanced tributary agreements. Our model ensures continuity and prevents catastrophic interspecies conflict through strict enforcement of defined spheres of influence. Explain the inefficiency that warrants external corrective action when our system demonstrably prevents large-scale collapse. The pause this time was fractional, milliseconds, but felt like an eternity of judgment. The human voice returned, clinically precise. The inefficiency is embedded in the structure of the equilibrium, not its immediate outcome. Your stability relies on the enforced stasis of lower-tier species. Tribute systems require the suppression of technological parity to maintain political leverage. This creates inherent stress points, resource hoarding at the apex, technological stagnation at the base. Over time, the stress fractures propagate through the political substrate. Your system trades long-term evolutionary potential for short-term geopolitical stability. In 300 cycles, the cumulative evolutionary pressure, driven by minor species achieving localized breakthroughs despite suppression, will breach the established containment fields, resulting in chaotic, sector-wide conflict utilizing energy scales that exceed current containment parameters. We project a 94.7% probability of localized species extinction events, exceeding 60% saturation across this region. The cold, statistical projection of planetary death resonated horribly in the conclave. It was not a threat, it was a mathematical certainty presented as fact. Counselor Thrax's temper finally broke. We are not contained. We are sovereign. Your projection is based on theoretical models that do not account for the strength of our resolve or the loyalty of our subordinate species. The human response was immediate and devastatingly simple. Loyalty predicated on perceived security is a quantifiable vulnerability. Resolve is an abstract variable. Physics is absolute. We require confirmation that the hegemony is willing to entertain a paradigm shift away from managed scarcity. The diplomatic dance was over. The humans had laid bare the entire scaffolding of the ascendancy's political existence and declared it structurally unsound. Chancellor Xylos knew then that diplomacy, as they understood it, was irrelevant. They were speaking to beings who viewed galactic empires the way a starship designer viewed an obsolete engine schematic. We acknowledge the complexity of your predictive models, Xylos responded carefully. However, a sudden transition from managed scarcity to unrestricted access would result in immediate internal societal collapse among the reliant populations, as they lack the foundational ethical and technological framework to process instantaneous abundance. We require a transitional methodology. a phased introduction of sustainable optimization techniques, perhaps, beginning with shared energy matrices. This was the true test. Would the humans agree to a gradual process, one that allowed the Cygnian hegemony to manage the transition, thereby preserving its functional leadership structure? The human reply shifted the tone, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The synthetic voice adopted a new resonance, one that suggested a vast internal processing capacity being dedicated solely to this singular interaction. Phase transition requires baseline compatibility. We have observed the Cygnian reliance on biosynthetic integration for complex data processing. This introduces variables of organic decay and emotional bias into critical infrastructure management. This is an unacceptable vector for optimized stability. There was a noticeable silence from the human vessel. Then the data stream from the observer altered again. It was no longer showing the external blueprint of the human ship. It was showing the internal architecture of the observer itself, rendered in perfect, real-time detail. Every life support conduit, every sensor relay, every neural interface connection point, all laid bare. Then one small section of the main Cygnian command console, the interface where Xylos himself interfaced with the ship's core systems, was highlighted. A single, elegant line of human schematic overlay appeared across the Cygnian design. "We do not require your current leadership structure to manage the transition," the voice stated calmly. "We require access to the primary conduit. Your current biological interface imposes an unnecessary bottleneck on data flow and decision latency. We will integrate the necessary parameters directly into the core command matrix. This process will require the temporary cessation of all biological input." The meaning was brutally clear. They were demanding control over the Cygnian command structure, bypassing the leaders entirely in order to implement their optimized solution. This was not diplomacy. It was a system patch being forced onto a network. Thrax erupted in fury, his voice vibrating the very floor plating. "Insolence! This is an act of invasion. Activate defense protocols. Detach the observer and prepare to sweep that vessel with thermal saturation." "Counselor, wait," Xylos commanded, holding up his hands, his crystalline structure rigid with a terrifying calm. He understood now. The humans did not recognize hierarchical authority derived from martial power or inherited status. They recognized only functional capability. And in this moment, the human vessel possessed functional capability over the observer's every subatomic particle. "We understand your reflexive defense protocol," the human voice acknowledged, entirely unperturbed by the threat. "However, your vessel is currently operating under gravitational parameters that place it entirely within our established field of local manipulation. If you attempt to detach or initiate any aggressive energy discharge, the resulting destabilization of the imposed equilibrium will result in the immediate catastrophic failure of the observer's primary containment shields. The vessel will be vaporized instantly by its own ejected reaction mass." The data stream provided the evidence instantly. A simulation showing the exact sequence of kinetic and thermal destruction should the Cygnian order be executed. It was undeniable. The observer was functionally a hostage, held not by weapons, but by superior physical law comprehension. Xylos looked out across the faces of the conclave. The fear, the betrayal, the dawning realization that the pillars of their civilization had been proven illusory. He made the most difficult decision in the entire history of the Ascendancy. "Transmit confirmation of compliance to the human vessel," Xylos stated, his voice flat, emotionless, yet carrying the crushing finality of a death sentence carried out by necessity. "Allow them access to the primary conduit interface on the observer. Inform the bridge crew that this is an operational necessity to prevent systemic extinction. We yield control of the transitional interface." The compliance signal was sent. The conclave hall settled into a profound, terrified silence, waiting for the imposition of the human patch. The human response was immediate. Instead of a stream of aggressive code, a single, small data module detached from the human vessel and accelerated with impossible precision, slotting itself perfectly into the observer's external docking port. A physical connection made across a distance that should have rendered such precision impossible. "Integration commencing," the human voice announced. "Duration, 4 standard Earth minutes. During this period, your political mechanisms are irrelevant. Observe." For those 4 minutes, The conclave experienced a sensory overload that transcended normal comprehension. They were not merely watching data. They were experiencing the direct, filtered perception of what the humans were doing inside the observer. The external displays in the conclave hall shifted from telemetry to a pure, internal view of the human insertion module interfacing directly with the Cygnian primary computer core. The humans were not uploading new military codes or establishing surveillance backdoors. They were optimizing. They were rewriting the operating system of the Cygnian vessel in real time, stripping away redundancies, eliminating inefficient processing loops, and integrating new, elegant mathematical frameworks for energy management and navigational computation. They were not destroying the Cygnian infrastructure. They were rendering it flawlessly efficient. When the 4 minutes elapsed, the connection module detached and returned to the human vessel, performing an identical, silent maneuver to re-establish its original station. "Integration complete," the human voice stated. "The observer of neutrality now operates at 100% theoretical efficiency based on available structural materials. Navigation latency is zeroed. Biosynthetic feedback loops are now managed by an external, non-intrusive arbiter, ensuring purely logical throughput to the biological consciousness centers. The vessel is now functionally optimized. We have demonstrated immediate, controlled capability without aggression or structural compromise." Xylos immediately re-established communication, a frantic need to understand the ethical framework driving this behavior surging through him. "You have modified our vessel. You have bypassed our command authority. Yet you have introduced no threat to the crew, only optimization. Why this methodology? Why not simply negotiate access to the vessel for study?" "Negotiation implies parity in understanding," the human responded. "Parity was not present. We do not destroy operational assets. We refine them. We have optimized the observer so that its crew can perceive reality without the filtering imposed by inefficient biological and political bias. The next phase of interaction requires you to perceive the data we have gathered without the impedance of fear or cultural accretion. We are transmitting the full data package now. Do not process it through cultural filters. Process it through objective logic. You will understand the need for our involvement." This time, the data package that flooded the conclave was overwhelming. It was not just infrastructure data, it was astronomical. It contained cosmological maps that extended far beyond the currently charted boundaries of the known galactic spiral arm. It depicted the formation and decay rates of localized stellar nurseries with perfect accuracy. And then, it showed the threat. It was a gravitational signature, not of a star or a nebula, but of something immense, artificial, and utterly dormant, located in the void beyond the furthest reaches of the Cygnians' most advanced deep space sensor arrays. This structure was orders of magnitude larger than any known megastructure, a vast, silent lattice spanning light years, built from materials that seemed to absorb ambient light entirely. It was clearly ancient dormant, yet its sheer scale implied a purpose beyond comprehension. "That structure," the human voice explained, devoid of awe or dread, simply stating a fact of physics, "is the source of a recurring, low-level informational drain upon the fabric of local space. It is not malicious. It is simply extant, a massive, decaying piece of forgotten engineering left over from a progenitor civilization that existed before the current iteration of galactic structure. It is a leak in reality, a slow entropy sink." Vrix was utterly stunned. "What is its function? Why has no one detected this level of mass before?" "Because your sensors are tuned to the decay signatures of baryonic matter and standard dark matter distribution. This structure exists partially outside of those observable parameters. It is anchored using principles you have not yet discovered. We detected it by monitoring the subtle harmonic distortions in the background quantum field." The human logic coalesced terrifyingly. The Ascendancy and its allies were consumed with managing local conflicts, resource distribution, and political dominance, all necessary functions within their current paradigm. But in doing so, they had completely failed to monitor the foundational integrity of the cosmic environment they inhabited. They were arguing about internal politics, while a slow, cosmic rot was consuming the basement of their shared reality. "Your current political models," the human continued with finality, "are inherently incapable of coordinating a species-wide effort that requires fundamental revisions to understood physics and resource allocation, because every proposal is filtered through localized self-interest and short-term survival metrics. The projection of energetic saturation," the local chaos event we mentioned, is directly correlated to the eventual inability of the local stellar groups to generate the necessary, unified power signature required to analyze and potentially neutralize the entropy sink before it reaches critical mass. This was core revelation. The human intervention was not about correcting the Cygnian hegemony's minor inefficiencies. It was about forcibly creating a stable, unified political entity capable of addressing an existential threat that dwarfed all known concerns. Xylos felt the millennia of Cygnian pride evaporate, replaced by a sobering, crystalline clarity. The humans saw the entire scope of existence, and they were inviting the ascendancy to stop playing games and join the real conflict. "You offer efficiency," Xylos responded, his voice steady, echoing the clarity he now felt. "And in return, you demand that we integrate your methodologies into our core structures." "We demand functional cooperation against a shared, measurable threat," the human corrected. "We do not demand governance. We do not require tribute. We require competence. We will provide the foundational knowledge to achieve stability commensurate with the scale of the threat. You provide the socio-political mechanism for implementation. We recognize that the integration of your species, the Cygnian, the Rhydonian, the Krill, and the others, into a single, unified command structure capable of executing this level of complex, multi-species engineering is beyond your current capacity for consensus. We will act as the catalyst to force that consensus." Thrax, surprisingly, was silent. He stared at the projection of the impossibly vast, light-devouring structure. The Krill Imperium had always valued strength above all else, and faced with a power capable of rewriting physics on the fly, and which demonstrated such profound, pragmatic ethics, refusing domination in favor of shared survival, he recognized a superior form of strength. "If we agree to the necessary centralization," Thrax ground out, "what is the immediate next step required by your analysis?" The human response was immediate. It was not a demand for ship blueprints or tactical data. "The next step is the dissolution of the current conclave structure. Consensus must be achieved at a unified point of operational authority. We require immediate, unfettered data access to all active research pertaining to exotic matter stabilization and high-energy particle channeling across all three primary powers. Send a single authorized vessel carrying the lead scientific cadre from each species, including the triumvirate, to rendezvous point Beta 9. We will provide the necessary interface hardware for collaborative analysis. This must occur within the next solar rotation." The request was audacious. Dissolve the central governing body and deliver its intellectual core directly to the alien entity. It was the ultimate surrender of political autonomy, traded for existential survival. Xylos looked at the anxious faces surrounding him. The Rhydonians looked terrified but intrigued by the promise of technical advancement. The Krill looked grimly ready for necessary sacrifice. "We accept the terms of engagement," Xylos announced, the decision instantly binding the fate of the sector. "The conclave is adjourned, pending reconstitution under a unified operational mandate. We will prepare the vessel for transit to Beta 9. Chancellor Xylos of the Cygnian Ascendancy, Ambassador Vrix of the Rhydonian Directorate, and Counselor Thrax of the Krill Imperium will constitute the scientific contingent." The transmission ended. The silence in the Grand Hall was different now. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of profound, shared purpose forged in the crucible of terrifying revelation. The rendezvous point, Beta 9, was a point in deep space deliberately chosen by the humans for its null signature background. A true void, far from any celestial or artificial interference. The Cygnian response vessel, now rechristened by its crew as the Vanguard of Necessity, approached cautiously, though the memory of its optimized performance provided a strange, unsettling confidence. It was followed closely by a compact Rhydonian research cutter and a heavily shielded Krill observation shuttle, each bearing the intellectual elite of their respective civilizations, their faces, or sensory organs, a composite study in apprehension and fierce curiosity. As the three vessels aligned near the designated coordinates, the human vessel remained stationary, a silent sentinel. But this time something else was present. Emanating from the human spindle was a localized field effect that wasn't strictly energy, nor gravity, but seemed to be a controlled warping of the informational substrate of space itself. As the three alien vessels entered this field, The effect on them was immediate and deeply psychological. Inside the Vanguard, Xylos felt an abrupt cessation of the low-grade ambient anxiety that had plagued the conclave. The residual political friction, the ingrained cultural biases, the subtle miscommunications that plagued interspecies dialogue, all seemed to thin, evaporating like morning mist. Chancellor Vrick's rapport. Ted, his voice calm, almost detached. My internal diagnostic suite indicates a profound reorganization of cognitive processing pathways. The ambient field appears to be inducing a state of near-perfect logical coherence. My capacity for abstract emotional assessment is temporarily suppressed in favor of pure analytical throughput. Thrax, whose krill physiology was notoriously resistant to external influence, confirmed the phenomenon with surprising reverence. My aggressive impulses are dampened. I perceive the utility of this environment. It forces clarity. They are not merely manipulating space-time. They are manipulating the environment necessary for objective thought. The human ship then projected a focused beam, a slender thread of structured light, onto the hull of the Vanguard. This was the delivery mechanism for the interface hardware. The drone robotics of the Cygnian vessel moved with an almost hypnotic efficiency, retrieving the package and bringing it directly into the primary scientific observation chamber, where Xylos, Vrix, and Thrax awaited, their scientific teams standing by in states of controlled anticipation. The hardware was deceptively simple. A smooth, featureless obsidian shell, smaller than a human hand, emanating a faint internal shimmer. The interface core is prepared. The human voice communicated directly into the chamber's comm system. It requires connection to the primary data nexus of your combined scientific archives. Once connected, it will act as a universal translation layer, allowing for the immediate, unambiguous exchange of high-level theoretical frameworks, irrespective of species-specific linguistic or conceptual barriers. Xylos directed his chief science officer to execute the connection. The moment the core made contact with the Cygnian nexus, which was, by extension, linked to the Rhydonian and Krill data banks, the chamber was plunged into a silent, informational torrent. It was not reading data, it was experiencing it. The Rhydonian experts, specializing in fluid dynamics and complex energy transport, suddenly understood the principles behind human inertial manipulation, not as equations, but as instinctive physical knowledge. The Krill military strategists grasped the underlying mathematics of predictive nonlinear conflict modeling that underpinned the human analysis of the entropy sink. And Xylos, the political leader, experienced the human concept of stewardship. He perceived that humanity, having achieved a level of technological mastery that rendered resource competition obsolete, had turned its focus entirely outward, viewing the universe as a vast, fragile mechanism requiring maintenance against external, fundamental decay. Their civilization was not driven by expansion, but by preservation, not just of themselves, but of potentiality across the cosmos. They were the universe's ultimate custodians. The exchange lasted only moments in subjective time, though the external monitors indicated several minutes had passed. When the connection severed, the chamber occupants blinked, readjusting to the sensory noise of normal existence, though the ambient field still held the tension of clarity. Vrix spoke first, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic tremor of awe. The data, the sheer processing power required to model the structural integrity of that ancient artifact. It suggests physics that operate on dimensional planes we only theorized existed in mathematical abstraction. Thrax nodded slowly, the aggressive posture entirely gone. The military implications are secondary now. If that structure fails, the cascading gravitational wave would render our entire galactic arm inert, regardless of fleet deployment or localized weaponry. We are faced with true, cosmic-scale oblivion. Their assessment of our internal squabbles as mere inefficiency is validated. We were worried about the boundaries of our garden while the foundation beneath the garden was dissolving. Xylos felt an overwhelming sense of humility, the crushing weight of ancient arrogance lifted away, replaced by the frightening lightness of true understanding. They are not arrogant. They are simply operating with a complete data set. We were blind, focused on the immediate political horizon. They have forced us to look at the true horizon. He turned to the communication console, addressing the human vessel one final time in this new, cooperative paradigm. Human intelligence. We have processed the initial data packet and the shared framework. We concede the necessity of unified action against the entropic sink. We place the operational leadership for this stabilization effort under your command, as per your initial directive regarding efficiency. What is the precise engineering requirement for neutralizing the sink? The human vessel, the enigmatic black spindle, remained silent for a moment longer than usual. The usual immediate response was delayed, suggesting a shift in the complexity of answer required. Then the synthesized voice returned, its tone subtly different, less clinical, perhaps incorporating the echoes of the shared intellectual space they had just experienced. The neutralization of the ancient entropy sink requires a massive, coordinated release of structured quantum energy, focused at precise nodal points on the lattice structure. This requires energy generation capabilities exceeding the output of one stellar cluster. It requires synchronization across multiple disparate civilizations to initiate the simultaneous firing sequence. The human then provided the schematic for the required energy release mechanism. It was a device of staggering complexity, requiring the assembly of materials harvested from collapsing stellar cores and precision manipulation of singularities, technology that was entirely theoretical for the assembled species. We possess the theoretical framework for the construction of the firing mechanism, which we can transmit immediately, the human continued. However, the construction and deployment phase requires logistical organization and sustained output that exceeds our current available manpower and local resource access. We require established operational entities to manage the material processing and construction phases over the next several standard centuries. Xylos leaned forward, seizing the opportunity presented by the invitation to build, rather than merely obey. We can manage the logistics. The Ascendancy excels at large-scale infrastructure management and resource distribution across disparate political entities. Rhydonia's mastery of energy channeling and Krill's rigorous standards for deep space structural integrity will allow us to construct the necessary delivery platforms. Agreed, the human stated. Your roles are crucial. You will build the vessels and power generators necessary to host our energy induction hardware. We will provide the schematics and the final firing methodology. This will be a cooperative endeavor built upon proven, objective parameters. A sense of momentous purpose settled over the three leaders. The fear of invasion had transformed into the exhilarating burden of cosmic responsibility. They were no longer squabbling over territory. They were assembling the tools to save reality itself. As the data streams for construction protocols began flooding the respective vessels, creating an unprecedented torrent of shared technical documentation flowing between Cygnian, Rhydonian, and Krill mainframes, Xylos permitted himself a final, philosophical query to their silent partner. Human intelligence, Xylos transmitted. Why? Why dedicate such profound resources and capabilities to the preservation of civilizations you deemed inefficient? Why expend vast effort on ensuring the survival of entities that operate under flawed, chaotic systems? The final response from the human vessel was not an immediate data burst, but a slow, unfolding narrative projected directly into the shared communication channel. A historical synopsis, rendered visually and intellectually through the same clear logic filter they had experienced moments before. The narrative showed the ascent of humanity. It detailed their own bloody, chaotic adolescence, the near-extinction events, the ideological purges, the moments where they nearly tore their own planet apart with increasingly powerful, self-serving weaponry. It showed them reaching the brink, the point where their own internal inefficiencies threatened annihilation. And then it showed the choice, not a sudden technological leap, but a philosophical one. They had looked outward, realized their localized conflict was meaningless against the backdrop of true cosmic challenges, and forged a unified, logical purpose, a purpose predicated on utility rather than dominance. When a mechanism demonstrates the potential for function, but is impeded by internal design flaws, the human voice concluded with an almost gentle finality, the logical imperative is to correct the flaw, not discard the entire mechanism. We have seen the potential latent within the structure of your combined civilizations, the capacity for massive engineering, for sustained coordination, for deep philosophical inquiry. This potential, if allowed to collapse due to systemic ignorance regarding the fundamental realities of our environment, represents an unacceptable loss of universal data processing capability. The projection shifted one last time. It showed a vast, complex network of light across the galaxy, the nascent collaboration between the Cygnian, Rhydonian, and Krill systems, now linked by the human-provided foundational technologies. This network was shown evolving, connecting, and growing stronger, all centered around the colossal construction efforts targeting the entropy sink. "We do not seek to rule," the human said. "We seek to ensure the integrity of the system in which we all operate. We see the universe as a vast, intricate clockwork. Flaws in the gears must be addressed, lest the entire mechanism seize." Xylos, Vrix, and Thrax exchanged a silent confirmation. They were humbled, integrated, and finally, truly, united. The age of the Ascendancy's self-serving hegemony was over, replaced by the era of collaborative survival, dictated by the quiet, ethical certainty of humanity. But just as the first construction modules began to vector toward the designated resource harvesting zones, a new signal interrupted the flow of engineering data. It was faint, ancient, and utterly terrifying. It was not a signal generated by the entropy sink, but something else entirely, piggybacking on the sudden, massive surge of structured energy the human vessel was currently using to map the sink's nodes. The new signal was incredibly complex, layered with cryptographic security far exceeding even the human's initial data packets. It was not local. It originated from far beyond the galactic rim, emanating from a region the human maps designated as uncharted dark. The human vessel's internal processing spiked visibly. The ambient cognitive field around the ships flickered erratically for the first time. "Anomaly detected," the human voice stated, the clinical neutrality strained for the first time by something resembling alarm. "The construction initiation sequence has triggered an unscheduled response beacon. This signal is responding to the specific harmonic pattern generated by our diagnostic probes interacting with the sink's substructure." "What is it?" Xylos demanded, leaning over the consoles, the engineering work momentarily forgotten. "It is a verification protocol," the human replied, the stream of data now showing the incomprehensible encryption of the incoming message. "The entropy sink was not a naturally decaying artifact. It was a containment structure. The signal we have just activated is a distress beacon triggered by the interference pattern of our analysis." A brief moment of shared, silent terror united the three ancient species and the pragmatic newcomers. "Containment structure for what?" Vrix whispered, though the question hung heavy in the void. The human responded, the final piece of information settling upon them like a shroud woven from cosmic cold. The transmission was not a command, but a final, stark warning, rendered in perfect, unadorned logic. The structure was designed to stabilize the localized vacuum against intrusions from entities that utilize methods of FTL travel fundamentally different from our own. Entities that do not manipulate space or time, but replace it. We believed we were maintaining the clockwork. We have just announced our location to the entities. This clockwork was designed to keep locked out. The massive alien lattice, the entropy sink, which moments before had been slated for dismantling, began to glow, not with heat, but with an internal, sickly violet light. The signal arriving from the edge of known space was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. The true, terrible frontier of reality had just been breached, and the human race, in its calm, ethical pursuit of cosmic efficiency, had just handed them the key.